For those of you who are joining for the first time today, Third Path Institute is a national nonprofit celebrating our 20th anniversary. And long before others discovered the importance of including men in the work-life integration discussion, or the science of pushing back at overwhelm so we can all work smarter, we were showing people how to do work, family, and leadership differently. Did you know that over 71,000 people checked out our free resources last year, like the live and recorded versions of our Thursday webinars? We're glad you're here today. And as you will quickly discover, today's webinar truly celebrates all that we have learned in the past 20 years. And as I say every time, I am so excited about today's webinar. I know I say that every time, but this time I'm really excited. I was so pleased to read Riche J.'s book, Raising the Race. It felt like an old friend because so many of the ideas she's talking about in this book are things that Third Path has been working on for years and years. So when I read it, I felt like Riche and I had been walking down two different hallways, but landed in the same room. However, you're going to hear me talk in a very excited way about all of this today, but I also know that Riche's book is describing stories that come from a history of hardship that includes racism, slavery, and Jim Crow, and that the solutions the families she talks about in her book are constructing are in part from this historical experience. So yes, we are maybe arriving in the same room, but there really is some historical differences in how we got here. That said, an interesting thing you'll hear in today's webinar is that we're really asking the question, who is the ideal worker? And as we unpack this today, I think you'll see that there is some real assumptions around who that ideal worker that connects a lot to the work that Third Path does. We're trying to change that assumption, and also to the people that Riche has looked at in her book. So welcome, Riche. I am so excited you're here. I thank you so much for making time today. Is there something you'd like to say to start with before we start talking about your awesome book?
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, everybody at Third Path Institute and all those who are listening. I think the way that I want to start is just to say that I think you did a wonderful job of kind of summarizing what I felt made this study so important, and that was to consider how the ways in which contemporary Black women, contemporary Black professional women are often in the same spaces as white women and other women of color in the halls of government and business and academia and so forth, but how we all got there has a different historical record and has meant people have needed to employ different strategies. And so I appreciate the fact that you were able to identify that and let your listeners know that right from the start, because I think that's one of the key things that makes this volume so important and the voices of these women so important.
Oh, yes, and it's just going to only go up and up and up in this conversation because there's just so many things that you talk about in that book that just were like aha moments for me to get me to think smarter. So it's a really fabulous book and a really fabulous research. And I guess where I want to start was, you know, you were looking at a very specific group of women. And how did you get interested in that group of women? I was listening to an interview of you, and it was such an interesting story how you ended up choosing this as the research project. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, absolutely. It was not my intention when I started, when I decided that I wanted to do a study in the Black community. I was initially planning, because I have a background also in urban studies, I was planning to look at some of the movements in gentrification that were happening in Atlanta, which, as I look at Atlanta today, I'm like, man, that was a really important study too. But I got a little sidetracked because I started my own family, and I started taking my daughter to story time at the local library, and I was at the library because I was in graduate school, and because I had finished my coursework and was beginning my research, I had a little bit of extra time in which I could take my daughter, once or twice a week to story time at the local library. And the library was in what we think of as a historically Black middle class neighborhood in Atlanta. And I was surprised to encounter a number of Black women, professional women, who were at story time at the same time as me, in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week. And that was not a pathway I knew about as a young person, and even as an adult, as I was coming into adulthood myself and starting my family. Everybody I knew worked. Every Black woman I knew worked, had always worked. Their moms had worked, their grandmothers had worked. And so when I encountered these women who were professionals, because we got to know each other, we were going back to story time repeatedly, week after week, and these same women were showing up, and I started asking questions, what's going on? How are you here? And these women were sharing with me their stories, that they were basically taking time away from work. Some of them not necessarily planning to go back. Some of them planning to go back, but not really sure when. So it wasn't really the kind of I'm on maternity leave type of situation. It was a more, they were seeing it, even if they didn't have a complete time frame in mind, as something that might be a little bit more long term. And they were doing it with no models themselves. They were talking with me about how their mothers had worked, and they, didn't really know how to make this work for their families, but they at the moment thought that this was the thing that they felt was important for their families and for themselves.
Yeah. In fact, what I heard you talk about in the book, which I thought was so interesting, is that they're basically saying that they were thinking about a solution that was around not just work and children, but maintaining their marriages, and that they were kind of interested in saying, I want to present a different portrait of Black families, and so that they, whether very consciously or unconsciously, there was some different thinking going on. Is that a fair assumption? Before I go on to the next slide, is that a pretty accurate assumption?
Yeah,
Your description?
right. And that's definitely right. And that was something, that I realized once I actually started the study. And so first I had to figure out if there was something to study here, and then come up with a research model, a research framework to talk with them about the decisions that they were making. And so, it turned out, as I was getting to know them better, what looked like a decision that had to do with, being a quote unquote at-home mom ended up being something much deeper than that, that had a lot to do with that last slide that you showed, that had more to do with how they were making decisions from a bigger framework about their responsibilities to their families and their communities.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're going to talk about that there are multiple factors that they were consciously or unconsciously bringing into their decision making. And it's really a powerful story of this different hallway that they entered to get to a kind of a more flexible or different approach to combining work and family. So one of the things that I have to do is I have to be the time monger, so to make sure we get through a couple of things and in a way to get you off the call at 1:15 today. And so one of the things that I took, one of the things I took away. So if you see me advancing a slide, it's because I'm kind of moving us along. That's just FYI.
Okay.
So you talked about kind of three subgroups of women, and I have these batteries on the left-hand side. I'll explain them in a second. You talked about a modified full-time career, and I put up one example of a woman who, was a good example of a modified full-time career, and someone who's in a flexible career, and then a modified stay-at-home approach. And each one, I think the word modified is very important in the description of this. Let me explain the batteries for 1 second, and then I want you to talk a little about these three different approaches. again, back to what Third Path has been looking at for 20 years is, when you're trying to combine work and family, there's many different ways of doing it. And so in a two-parent household, now this could be a two-parent household with dads or two-parent household with moms, you could have both of them working full-time. So that's the blue, and coming home and having time with the family in the evenings, or you could have one parent working full-time, the other one working in a more flexible way, or you could have what's called traditional. Now, it could be the dad who stays home, or it could be the mom who stays home. So we've been using that same language about there's these different models of how people balance work and family. That little green at the top is the idea that all of us do better if we have a little bit of recharge time. And that sometimes feels like hard for families to figure out, but this is the ideal. We're trying to talk about there's these three different models of families, and hopefully all of them have a little bit of recharge time in addition to work and family. So how did this connect to the folks that you saw and these different arrangements? Any thoughts you want to share about this?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that I want to say, and I'm going to try to pay attention to time too. I was, in coming up with these three kind of flexible portrayals of how these women were dealing with decisions about their careers, I wanted to address this question, and they actually revealed it to me that this dichotomy that we usually think about as work versus family is not actually working out for anybody. How do you combine work and family, the work and family conflict, all this different language, and then the dichotomy between those who are at home and those who work. And so what I found was that there was a lot of flexibility going on, and I tried to capture it in these three ways, which I hope is pretty self-evident in the titles. But if not, I encourage listeners to get the book. And so in terms of time for recharge, which I really like the battery model that you have posted. Time for recharge was still something that was very difficult to locate in each of these models. And so what ended up happening was that what they were modifying or making more flexible for themselves was a way to address work and family and community responsibilities and marriage. So it still left very little recharge time.
Yeah. In fact, that came across very loud and clear in the book, how much this commitment, not just to work, family, marriage, but community, really was a lot. However, what you could see, what was interesting to see in the stories, and I didn't even intend to talk about this, was that, kids grow up. And so some of the solutions emerged and became easier as children got a little older. Not necessarily. Again, there's some things that are challenging that all of them were dealing with, but it was interesting to see how some of these answers emerged because they went from dealing with what I call the new parent stage to more of the school age stage. And again, there's just so much to say about how they were all working together as a family system to think about this stuff that was just beautiful to read about.
Thank you. And I think you list Karen as the available flexible career example, but Marilyn is always one that I really enjoy talking about because she did that thing that you just mentioned. As her kids went through various stages of their development, she went in and out of full-time work. And she was able to do that. And I think this is very important for thinking about how we can get workplaces to be more responsible. She was able to do that at the same employer.
Oh, wow. Great.
Yeah. So she just kept, she was in medical insurance. She was in medical insurance management. In her career, and she worked for an insurance company, and she was able to, at each stage, as she determined whether or not she needed to be more available at home or needed to do more in her workplace, they allowed her to go in and out, and that she was the only one that had that kind of model.
Yeah, well, you say something so very true in your book. You talk about how this flexibility that these women were looking for is just so hard to find. And so I'm just going to talk about this slide for like 3 seconds. But for those of you who've been listening into Thursday webinars or know the 20-year history of our work, that's what we've been trying to do as an organization, is to say, hey, we need a different model of how we approach work and caring for our children, or work and caring for our aging parents. And the model we've been looking at is something we call shared care, where in a two-parent household, and that might be a two-parent household that's now divorced, that both parents can be workers and caregivers, and that's going to be a healthy solution for our families, for society, for our workplaces. That's been our long-term vision, and that's when I was reading about your families, there really was this beautiful parallel. We'd arrived in a similar hallway, but from very different historical backgrounds. But that's one of the things I want to talk about. There's some lessons to take away from your amazing book that I would recommend people getting. Fairly fabulous. And one is that, I started with this by saying that, Black mothers never had the option to not work. But you'll hear later, we have a good friend of mine, Pawnee Cousins, who's going to be talking about her aunt and the role her mom and aunt played together around how it's, maybe the better phrase is, Black mothers seldom had the option not to work. And that right there is already how there's a historical difference that needs to be talked about and thought about when we think about work and family and this intersectionality. Tell us a little bit more about this intersectionality approach and the wisdom behind it.
Yeah, so there are a lot of scholars who have been really for, probably about 30, 40 years writing in the literature the importance of an intersectional approach that understands the ways in which race, class, and gender, sexuality, all, and even sometimes religion, all work together in interlocking ways to have an impact on the way that people are able to live their lives, not necessarily about choices all the time, but the ability to live your life. And even before we had intersectional approaches, like I said, 30, 40 years ago, written into the record as intersectional, we had, scholars thinking about it, even going back as far as Sojourner Truth, who was, asking the question of, being an enslaved individual that was also a woman. Also a Black woman. And so how does that change the way that womanhood is constructed when we talk about, as she said, women need to be protected, but Black women weren't being protected? And I think the way that you talk about Black mothers and this idea of seldom having the option to work, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think even as I was doing the historical record, and you'll see this even in the book, I don't want to paint a picture that Black women, were never at home. But what's particular about that story of being at home is that there would often be, kind of, excuse me, one woman or one or two women who were at home, who were being, who were able to do that because of their class position, or because of their because they may have been descended from, if we go back into, the very historical record, they may have been descended from the white slave owners, who might take care to make sure that they were free and make sure that they were educated, and create a situation in which they were treated more like women of stature than enslaved Black women. And that carries forward into, the contemporary period, where we have even Black men wanting to, quote unquote, protect their women by making sure they don't have to work in people's homes, and don't have to put themselves in a position where they might be in, sexually, how do I want to say, they might be preyed upon in particular environments. So there's always been that. There's also been the case that even amongst the lower classes, some older Black women might be chosen to be the women who would stay at home and watch everybody's children while women were working, other women were working. So
Right.
so I don't mean to say that we've never had Black women who were, quote unquote, at home moms, but there's a
Right.
history even around that, right? Of
Yeah.
what made
Yeah.
that possible and why.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah. And I think today's webinar is trying to explode some of these assumptions about, who does what. And again, we're not going to spend time on it yet, but again, think about the opposite of this. The ideal worker has no other family responsibilities. So, we're going to get to more discussion about the ideal worker later, but, so the Black mothers seldom had the option not to work, and the ideal worker, never had any family responsibilities. So there's something going on here. We need to be, we're unpacking who is this ideal worker. And I would argue that probably this ideal worker is a white male who had a stay-at-home white wife. And so we're going to get there. But it's interesting how it all plays out and connects. There's some, again, just to keep us moving along, there's also some assumptions that, single parents, if we think single parents, African American mom. Well, the truth is there's a lot of diversity in single parents.
yeah.
And when we've done work to look at what a single parent does who's really thought about how to share care, well, top left picture, that's a mom we know where they were shared care parents when they were married, and then they got divorced, and the dad kept on sharing the care after the divorce. Or top right picture, there's a single parent dad. Great story we have from a while ago. And later in this broadcast, you're going to hear from Connie Cousins, another great example of a single parent mom, but she's got this great historical story too that adds a twist to all of this. So there's a lot more diversity out there than we seem to give any group appreciation for. So you'll hear Connie's story a little bit later. Anything you want to add about kind of the assumptions about these, how we all look? Otherwise, I'm going to go on to lesson number 2, which is the important lesson about how a network of care is so important. Anything you want to add before we talk about the network of care?
No, I think what I was going to add just had to do with where I think you're going with the lesson, the network of care. So we can go right into that.
Great. Yeah, because I think that was another takeaway for me is when I think about shared care families who we've been looking at for 20 years, really the message of a shared care parent is I can't do it by myself. I can't work and care for my family and feel like I've got my head on my shoulders. I need others very much deeply involved with me to make it all work. And often it's more than just their partner. If they happen to be a 2-parent family, my mother-in-law was this amazing resource all the way through when we were raising our children. And everybody's got a story about who was kind of built into their network of care. And when I read your book, it was just an absolute reminder that, I thought I was telling parents to do something so smart. And here's this history of this network of care in Black families that's, long before. Tell us a little bit more about where that history came from and what you saw around this in your book.
Yeah, I draw heavily, again, from the historical record. Angela Davis did a wonderful piece back in the 70s called, I'm gonna botch the name, but it has these words in it: Black women in the community of care in the slave society, and it was basically her saying that. Even as similar to the quote that you have posted on this slide, that Black women, whether they had their own biological children or not, have always been invested in the care work of all of the children. And I want to say that that counter to a lot of popular belief, even though Black families tend to have a higher proportion of single parent families, and it typically tends to be single mothers. There's a long, very long, deeply rooted history of extended care where Black women and Black men have been involved in the care of children, whether they were biological or not. And even we've seen recent reports where we're told, based on a number of studies, that even when Black men are no longer with the mother of their children, they tend to have higher rates of, not necessarily financial support, but support in terms of providing care, being in touch, spending time, and things like that. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's always been
Yeah.
a network of care. I think in my book, what I was trying to understand and wrap my mind around was the fact that as these women were making decisions about their commitment to their marriages, I was trying to ascertain what effect that was having on the network of care that extended beyond the nuclear family.
Uh-huh.
And I was trying to understand, because part of what was happening with the women in this book is, since they were professionals, many of them had moved away from their families of origin. And
Yep.
so the family of origin tended to be where they would find that network of care. By being in a different city, they had to create a network of care. And
Yep.
sometimes the creation of that network of care just took more time than one had,
Yes.
while juggling, career, motherhood, and marriage. And so,
Yes.
I find that many of the women, part of what was making them decide to, be in a flexible relationship with work was not having that network of care, that they would have been able to depend on had they stayed in their city of origin or town of
Yeah.
origin. And I think
Yeah.
that that's, when we get to kind of big picture, societal economic forces, I think that's something that we have to continue to look at, because, more and more cities are being faced with, this the technological advancements that are making it harder for people to be able to find work, in the cities that they were born in, or the towns that they were
Yep.
born. And
Yep.
so they're moving away from their families, and that's creating a different type of a network of care and dependence
Yes.
on more of a nuclear family model, which hadn't been the model of choice for Black families historically.
Right. 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 No, and what you're getting at, and this is perfect because the next slide is going to talk just briefly about this, is, again, you're looking at the context of professional careers and how this plays out for Black women. And so part of the storyline is what's the impact of professional careers on families, women, and men? And you're asking that great question of, part of it is these assumptions around what we need to do to move ahead in professional careers that might actually need to be questioned. And we don't have time to tell your story. I mean, you've had some interesting ways you've been managing this in your own life, but I'll tell you one quick story of how to get us to think outside the box. One young woman I was talking to recently figured out that her mom was going to need lots of help for the next year or so around some elder care stuff. She works in Philadelphia. Her mom lived in California. And because of the work she did, she was someone who did some of the web work for this nonprofit organization. She negotiated to go live near her mom and do the
Yeah.
work from California. So there's just so many ways we can start thinking differently about all this if we don't get stuck in the quagmire of who's the ideal worker, and we can break that down a little bit. So again, we're not going to spend time on this today, but we've done a lot of work as an organization to kind of think about a new kind of leader, a leader who basically doesn't see themselves as, I've got to put work first the entire time. Instead, I want to do work and have time for caregiving, whether that's my children or my parents or both. And so they're really pushing back at these norms of what the ideal worker is. And what we've seen in order for them to do this is they have to think differently around work. That wasn't really the focus of your book, although all your women in the book were doing work differently. But they have to do home differently, and that's what you talk about in your book. And they have to think differently about money. And I have to tell you, Riche, your book was the first book. I'm going to skip over this slide. This is just reminding us that people who do integrated careers improve how they work. Instead, I'm going to go to the next slide. Mm-hmm. Your book was the first book I've ever read about work, family, the interface between work and family, where you talked about money and how these families solved the financial equation to make it all work. And I don't think that's a coincidence that you are a Black woman who wrote about work and family, and you wrote about money, because again, if we think about that assumption about who the ideal worker norm is, it's a white man. And the assumption is that a white woman doesn't have to think about money at some point. She could step out of work and not earn money. Mm-hmm. And here was a book where, of course, you couldn't step out and not think about money, you know? So it was really interesting to see you talk about how finances, how these families were thinking about finances in some very interesting ways. There's tons we could say about this. What do you think about my take on your book?
Absolutely. I mean, I felt like I couldn't really tell this story without asking them about how they did. Because what's at the center of whether or not you can have a flexible relationship with work is where your money is coming from. How are you going to sustain your family? If one person isn't working or one person isn't working full time. And so, that was, I, knew when I was creating the interview guide, I was going to have to answer this question about, where they were getting their money from. And it was quite illuminating, talking with them and asking them, and I thank them, repeatedly. I want them to know how thankful I am that they let me into that, what tends to be a very personal aspect of family life, is talking about your income and your assets and your debts and, what you can and can't afford. And if you have an inheritance and all that kind of stuff. So yes, thank you for noticing.
Oh, it hit me like a ton of bricks. It was just so interesting how much it was absent in all the other books I had read and not noticed its absence. Let's just say that. I had not even noticed its absence. I read your book and I'm like, holy cow, look at this. And doesn't that speak volumes that it wasn't there before,
Yeah, one of the main things that, when I started on this work, lots of people were telling me Black families, Black women aren't home because they can't afford it, right? Black families can't afford it. And even as I was talking with the families, even as they were making these decisions, they were very clear about their understanding that it was a very precarious decision to make, right? Even if these are professional, many of them upper class families, they know that most of them are just one generation away from, not having had anything, so they're clear about the fact that, as their financial circumstances are often dependent on their employers, they have to put some other things in place for themselves. So a lot of them were doing entrepreneurial things. They were doing real estate investing. They were doing other types of income producing enterprises, while at the same time, trying to advance their careers. Especially the men were advancing their careers in the corporate sphere, while the women were either doing or helping them to do other income producing activities.
And again, we'll weave in for a second this ideal worker norm because there's data now that people who put work first for the first time. Claire K. Miller is a great journalist in the New York Times, and she wrote an article about how for the first time, people who put work first and work more than full-time hours are actually earning more income. And so in other words, there is risk involved to be a professional and to set boundaries around your career. And so again, like our shared care families, we tell our shared care families, you got to think about money to make it all work because you're going to face some risk. And how are
Yeah.
you going to manage that risk? Now, again, we walked down 2 hallways, got to the same room that you need to think about money. But I want to put up the next slide, and I am watching the clock to keep you on schedule. You know, this is a bold statement, but it really came across in your book that really, when you read the stories, why some of this was happening is because they were facing racism at the workplace. And
Yeah.
there was one story that really hit home where I think it was 2 of them working at the same workplace, and there was literally a discussion, this is too risky for both of us to work at the same place.
Mm-hmm.
Because of racism, because of the unexpected dismissal or layoffs that could happen, and the need to be able to manage that. And again, just a very powerful message that came across loud and clear, and very important message in your book. What would you like to add about this?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you lifting the fact that, that racism is still alive and well, but showing up in a lot of different ways that are much harder to identify. And
Yeah.
so what families felt like they had to do was kind of create a buffer
Yep.
for themselves. And that's, again, not new. That's something that Black families have always done. And part of the reason why Black women have been a stronger participant in the workforce, often sometimes more than Black men, because it's been easier for them to find and keep a job than Black men who risked, especially in blue collar labor. Black men risked a lot more possibility of layoffs.
Hmm.
Um, and Black women could more easily find positions that were, secretarial or administrative or in education, social work, things of that nature that offered a little bit more stability, nursing, things like that offered a little bit more stability than Black men who found themselves, more often in, blue collar types of labor, up until we get to the increase in affirmative action and in at least government employment. So it made it harder for people to lose their jobs, or not even have access to particular types
Right.
of jobs.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, putting in ways to have extra income is so not new.
Yes.
But I think
So not
what
new.
I think what was new for these families was the way the industries that they were getting into,
Yep.
industries that would allow them to make much more money, but were also not as predictable, a little bit riskier. And so, one of the women that I talk about in the book is Nancy, whose husband was an attorney and then decided to go into construction and real estate. Built, he was, basically became a builder and a real estate investor, which paid well. They got a lot of big contracts. She'd been a physician, and so she pulled back from her position and helped him. But when Atlanta went through the recession, and most of that recession hit the housing industry, he basically, his business basically went out of business.
Yep.
So and this is one of the things that I talk about in terms of like shoring up your kind of your own personal and family safety nets. Even though she had stepped back from being a physician, she kept up with her medical boards. So
Yep.
when his business went under, she was able to very easily, reach out to some contacts and get back into a hospital as a internist. So that is the way that, being in a more professional, right, higher income, you
Yep.
are, your opportunities for greater financial advancement are bigger. But the fall can also be, just as
Yep.
devastating. And so these women,
Yep.
these families, these women were aware of that. And so,
Yep.
they were as families, having these really tough discussions about how to make sure they could, sustain their families if something awful happened.
Yep. Yeah, no, it was, and again, Riche, what's so cool is that if you hear the shared care families we've been working with for 20 years, that concept of have to be careful, planful, create a buffer, because, again, they were basically saying, here's a simple example, a family that I know where they both worked a 4-day work week when their baby was born as a way to share having one daddy day, one mommy day, and 3 days of childcare. Well, they
Mhm.
knew it was a risk to work a 4-day work week. And so they had to set up their lives to manage that potential economic risk. So it was just
Yeah.
so interesting to hear these very incredible parallels. I'm watching the clock. I'm going to get you off in a second, let you have a last thought in a second. Basically, if you're listening in today, you're not surprised to know that Third Path basically says, hey, we can create a different solution for people across the life course. It turns out, whether you're early in your career, raising children, or later in your career, there's going to always be work and something else you want to take time for. And in order for us to really get there, you've been listening into how some families figure this out for themselves. But obviously, we need to really think about better public policy, better organizational support. There's so much change that still needs to happen. And I think what I took away from your book is when Third Path thinks about this, we need to apply this intersectional approach and think
Mhm.
about how it does race, class, gender, you added a couple others, sexual orientation, religion. How does this play into imagining a world where we're really truly supported to do work well and do family and caregiving and community well too? We're going to hear from a couple more people in a second. I'm going to tell you what's coming up next. But just to make sure I get Riche out the door on time, is there one last word you'd like to share with our listeners today? And I can't thank you enough for being here today.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate being here. And you asked such great questions, and your slides have been awesome. I'm particularly interested in this last slide and the the um, the kind of list you have over to the bottom right,
Yep.
which includes organizational support and good public policy. And I think I can't stress that enough. The last chapter in my book is where I try to lay out some things that I think might make for good policy, good public policy, and good workplace policy. But
Yep.
it's a very difficult thing for us to think about and contend with because our country isn't going in that direction. At the moment, we're
Yep.
going in a direction that puts more responsibility on families
Yep.
for taking care of ourselves. And we've had an erosion and will continue to have an erosion of some of the safety nets that we've always had in place for people. Or
Yep.
I shouldn't say always had in place, but we've come to hope for and work towards.
Yep.
And so as those things are being eroded, I'm increasingly aware of the impact that's going to have on particularly our generation. I think, Jessica, you and I are probably in the same generation, that middle bracket,
Yep.
um, where
Yep.
we're starting to, you know, we have kids that are getting older, maybe getting out of the house, and we have parents who are getting older and needing more of us. Um, and
Yep.
we don't have the same safety nets. My husband and I talk about this all the time. We're not going to have Social Security. We're pretty sure we're not going to have Social Security, and all of our funds are in the market. Our retirement.
Yep.
Everyone is pushing people to retirement funds in the market, and
Yep.
that's we know how risky that is from looking at the
Yep.
last recession. So I just I'm hoping that we can figure out a way, and maybe it's with organizations like yours, to pivot our conversation back to one that recognizes that families can't do all of this work by ourselves.
Yep.
We're also being squeezed by changes in public school structure,
Yep.
so that more and more people are struggling with whether or not they need to send their children to private school because there's been an erosion of public schools.
Yeah.
So we're just in a a place that makes me concerned
Yeah.
about how we're going to work through all of this. And I think the intersectional approach becomes even more important because, as we've seen in the news, there's a growing entrenched divide between the haves and the have-nots.
Yep.
And the people who are at the very top of the wealth bracket versus the people that are at the bottom and even in the middle. So I think we've got a lot of work to do. And I think, organizations like yours that are putting some light on the struggles that families are having, and the decisions that people are having to make, and the way that they're having to string together these networks. It's great. It makes us more communal, but it also means that we're facing more precarity.
Yes. Yes. No, we need more. I mean, there's so much you said that's wise right there. But bottom line, we all benefit from better safety nets, and we are seeing an erosion of those safety nets, not an expansion of those safety nets. So I
Yeah.
hear you loud and clear, Riche. Thank you so much. I hope we'll have you on again for some webinar in the near future. And really, thank you so much for making time today.
Yeah, I'd love to come back. My new project is looking at what I was talking about at the end, the, kind of erosion of public schools and the
Oh,
decisions
yeah.
families are
Yes.
having
Oh, we'll
to
have you back. Yes. Yes.
make.
Let's make sure we talk about that. Yes. So such an important talk about. We could just start a whole other conversation right there. Thank you, Riche.
Thank you
We
so
really
much.
appreciate it. All right. Great. Great. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
For those of you who
Bye-bye.
are listening in, the conversation doesn't stop here. We have two more people who are going to be sharing some insights today. We're doing it slightly different today. We're going to have these Pawnee Cousins, a good friend of mine, is going to share some insights about her thoughts on today's conversation. Another good friend of mine, Charlotte Hurst, will also be sharing her thoughts on today's conversation. And the way we're going to do it is actually as part of the Q&A today. So if you are here today live, you get to hear from Pawnee and Charlotte and their thoughts on today's important conversation. And we're so glad you're here to be part of our live audience. If you are listening into the recording, please come to a live event and join us, because we do have some special conversations that happen on the Q&A. Coming up next month, we have another couple of amazing conversations happening. Next month in particular, we have two great leaders who will be sharing how they created a flexible approach to work and family and succeeded in their careers. And thanks for joining us. We have a really terrific event happening on April 30th. You can find out more about our website, but this is an open invite event that anybody could attend. If you're excited to learn more about a work-life integration and how you can support more people to follow an integrated approach, join us on April 30th. And stay tuned for the live Q&A. Thanks for being here.